expressions of anger and defiance, the convulsions of a revolution. Young, black and poor, they converged on the capital city to march against institutionalized inequality and racism. But perhaps most ironic of all, they marched against a leader long revered as the father of the nation. In 1956, Dr. Eric Williams stood here in the University of Woodford Square promising deliverance from colonial masters. And while independence in 1962 put political power in the hands of the nation, foreigners still controlled the economy.
At that time, Independence Square had Royal Bank of Canada, Bank of Nova Scotia, First Citizens Bank, Chase Manhattan Bank, Barclays Bank, and all of them were arranged in Independence Square. And as young people, we found that so absolutely ridiculous. Here's your Independence Square with all these headquartered banks in the country.
By 1970, the major banks were all foreign, and so too the bulk of the insurance and financial sector. The core of the economy, oil and sugar, was foreign-owned. What was local in retail and manufacturing belonged to white Creole family companies.
You're not going to get into parliamentary control, right? That the control lies with those who control the economy. People are now beginning to realize that there's a serious relationship between economic power and political, right? They now see that you don't have to be in parliament to control their destiny.
Government hoped that its program of industrialization by invitation would attract foreign capital and develop the fledgling economy. But the masses had little to show for it. By 1970, 14% of the population was jobless. Dr. Williams ensured that young people had greater access to education, but many left school only to face unemployment. Shantytown and Laventille still suffocated under the weight of poverty. In the cane fields of Caroni, freedom from British masters was an idea, not a reality.
Where your mother and sister and grandmother have to drag a 45-pound chain. Tears come to my head sometimes. A 45-pound chain to earn a day work to wrap cane, sugar cane, and put on a bull cart to take to the mills. How you feel about that?
That kind of exploitation triggered workers' protests throughout the 1960s. Dr. Williams blamed the unrest on what he called the subversive elements of the society, which he believed wanted to unite trade unions in oil and sugar. He was not going to see that happen. Government passed the Industrial Stabilization Act in 1965, forbidding strikes without permission.
The resistance of the working class all over the world, their most powerful weapon was withholding their labor in order to get conditions and benefits and salaries and so on. And here was the law, the industrial stabilization, that almost prohibited strikes.
Mr. Dagger says people were convinced that when a black government came into power, the system would be put to work for the benefit of the masses. But he believes now, as he did then, that conventional politics cannot bring about that kind of fundamental change.
Williams erred by not tackling the very system that oppressed the people for all the years of colonialism. Nothing was changed. And that is because the powers that be that control the economy in the way I've just mentioned had things in such a way that to move them you had to have something very revolt. Right? And that is where Williams failed.
Kamaluddin Mohammed, a founding member of the PNM and a government minister at the time, defends Dr. Williams. He points out that the first Prime Minister inherited a society structured by centuries of colonialism.
I think Dr. Williams believed that he was doing enough because he wasn't done. I think they expected too much. I think they thought that he could have delivered more speedily and more effectively.
But the structure of the economy wasn't the only vestige of colonialism oppressing blacks and East Indians. They still had to wrestle with racism.
arrives at the pilot
A black prime minister, a freely elected government that was predominantly black, and freedom from white foreign rule had finally been achieved.
And people understood that immediately, right? That is overlordship of their lives. This refusal to even let them complain. This incoherence of even their existence was coming to an end.
But merely establishing a national government couldn't dismantle the white power structure. Kafra Kamban, known in the 1960s as Dave Darbo, says racial discrimination was still glaring.
You had places here that from banks to insurance companies to other private companies where with a black skin you could not get hired except at the very lowest level. Whether it was a waiter in the Colonial Club, whether it was a doorman in the bank.
Managerial positions were virtually off limits to blacks. In fact, certain professions were seen as exclusive to whites.
BWIA stewards, white and light colored, fair. Certainly pilots and so on, no black pilots. Nobody want to fly with no black pilot. We do on the plane, you go crash the plane.
Even in Carnival, a celebration derived from African culture, racism prevailed. The JC's Carnival queen was always white, or at the very least, fair-skinned. There was also growing resentment towards the church. Mr. Kamban paints the church as a brainwashing agent controlled by the white elites.
People were meant to put their pennies, to come and let their minds be controlled. But they were not motivated by the church to things that were important to them, to deal with the poverty in their lives.
During the 1960s, the masses slowly awakened to these injustices. The Black Power movement in the United States was also a potent influence.
To be put together as a black army.
There, Stokely Carmichael, a Trinidadian-born American activist, had emblazoned the name Black Power onto the global movement. His words percolated in the minds of the masses here at home.
We have to recognize who our major enemy is. The major enemy is not your brother, flesh of your flesh and blood of your blood. The major enemy is the hunky and his institutions of racism. That's the major enemy. That is the major enemy.
One of the institutions of racism that Anzac sought to overturn was white cultural imperialism. Lasana Kwesi, a poet who emerged during the revolution, says blacks were constantly bombarded with white role models.
Since I was small, I seen Jesus white, he mommy white, he daddy white, Afa Apple white, Totally white, Twisty white, the bankman white, the storeman white, the priest white, Tarzan white, Hannibal white, they say Phantom white, the TV white, the film stars white, white, white.
Conditioned to believe they were inferior, many blacks developed a sense of self-hatred. Mr. Daga says black people could never be politically or economically empowered if they don't understand their African identity.
And as long as the people do not have some self-image, right, or self-power, or self-gratification, right, or self-understanding and appreciation, they can never be free.
Trapped in this mental slavery, Anzac's call for black pride ignited a powerful psychological movement.
I was entitled to wear my own clothes, wear my hair natural. That my sense of beauty was not to be straightening my hair and bleaching my skin. That I was beautiful the way God made me.
No more inferiority complex because we know. Look at the shine.
That movement would burst onto the national stage in February 1970 when Anzac's cry for black power struck a chord with the masses. Fane Richards, C News. Close to 200 people, mostly university students, assembled here on South Quay. They were led by Anzac's Gennis Granger, then president of the UE Student Guild, and Dave Darbo. Their plan? To march in solidarity with West Indian students on trial in Canada for an incident at the Sir George Williams University. 11 of the students charged with destroying a computer lab during a protest against a racist white professor were Trinidadian. The target of the protest on February 26 became the Royal Bank of Canada.
A kind of panic scene start. I saw some of the white young fellas and they run in the vault, they closing the vault. You understand? They just panic. Some of the demonstrators jump over the counter and saying, we want to see where our black people working, and so on and so on.
Then the move that would spark a firestorm of controversy. They stormed into the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception on Independence Square. For 2 hours, protesters remained locked inside. To this day, there's speculation about what transpired behind closed doors.
2 demonstrators with black shirts took off their black shirt. One hung it on St. Peter and the other one on the Virgin Mary and say, we want a black Jesus. That was the most that happened.
By the time they emerged, thousands were waiting outside. The day of reckoning had arrived. In the coming days, what had begun as a student protest transformed into a social revolution for change. Port of Spain became the epicenter of the uprising. Crowds spilled out of the exits in Woodford Square to hear visions for the empowerment of the oppressed. But the man who captivated the masses as no other could was Geddes Granger, later known as McCandle Dagger.
Dagger could really, stir up the passions of a crowd, not just with empty rhetoric, but with a rhetoric that had substance.
At some point, somebody had to rise. Perhaps fortunately or unfortunately, it happened to be me, right? But it could have been anybody who was saying the right things to the right people.
NJAC led increasing thousands of protesters into street demonstrations. They marched through the symbol of poverty, the abiding call, power to the people. The church continued to be a primary target. N2 Pearl Springer immortalizes the anger against the church in her poetry.
In time, we smashed those statues or painted them black, black like we in vengeance, wrecked on a God with seeming bias against our color.
Confrontations with police often turned violent. Outside of the marches, Molotov cocktails were thrown into businesses. The revolution got the blame. What is noticeably absent from the history books is NJAC's condemnation of the violence.
Even if it would happen again, I, for one, would not get on a platform and condemn it, because it is almost a natural reaction of people, given what they were feeling at the time.
So who was the real culprit?
I would not say that the NJAC, through its region, cannot hold itself responsible for some of the violence that occurred, right? That would not be honest to me. But a lot